Hello, good evening, ma'am.
Hi, hi.
Am I audible to you, ma'am?
Yes, you are.
Okay, brilliant.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Good evening to everyone who's joining in today. Today's discussion is going to be on the theme of the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the emerging world order. Um, so let me begin by introducing our esteemed guest. Professor Anuradha Chenoy is retired professor, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is currently adjunct professor at the UP Jindal Global University. She has written several books and articles, and she is also published with the PW. Today we will be discussing her article on the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the changing world order. I extend a very, very warm welcome again to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let us begin this discussion with my first question, which is, when you look at the present crisis, there are multiple narratives that emerge. So could you break down the contrasting sides to this present conflict for us, and how exactly do we begin to approach it?
Well, look, these narratives are extremely important and strong. And so let me give you the various narratives.
Sure.
Now, the American and the collective West narrative is that Russia, unilaterally and without any reason entered into Ukraine and was an aggressor on 24th February. There was no reason why they should be there, and it was a unilateral act of war. That Putin is crazy, he's authoritarian, and he is led Russia into this war without thinking about it. Russia is a weak power; they will lose, etc. And that along with this narrative is the fact that America is a unipolar power. It needs to be a primary hegemonic power, and their policies and politics moves towards that. Now, the Russian narrative is that none of this coincides with fact. And the fact is that this war did not begin in February 2022. In fact, there's been a civil war in the Ukraine since 2014, where ethnic Russians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, they're ethnic Russians, living in eastern Donbass, they have been facing a lot of problems with Ukraine, cultural problems. They want to be part of Russia. The Ukraine passed laws that they would be only Ukrainian as official language. They don't give them their cultural rights. So they wanted to secede, and there was this civil war in Donetsk, Luhansk, and they declared themselves people's republics. And in fact, they started having laws which were sympathetic to the ethnic Russians and not coinciding with the Ukrainians. That was one issue.
Right.
The second was, since the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia became independent, they have been telling the West, collective West and NATO, that please do not expand to our borders. They said this, Gorbachev said it, then Yeltsin said it, then Putin said it. But under Clinton, under everyone else, all the American presidents, they kept expanding. And as a consequence, almost all the former East European, the countries which were in the Soviet bloc and former Soviet republics started joining NATO. Finally, in 2008, at the Munich and at a conference where NATO was present, Russia was present, Putin said that Ukraine and Georgia, and actually Ukraine is a red line for us. Do not make Ukraine into part of NATO. It will be putting missiles on our border. And it is a huge security risk because the major security issue of Russia is the Black Sea. And this will cut them off.
Right.
It jeopardizes their very existence. And they kept repeating this, but the West did not listen. They thought Russia is a country with just a gas pump, and they were not really interested in talking to Putin on these two major issues. So first, of course, Russia went into Crimea in 2014, and this talk about Ukraine joining NATO started in 2014. America started kind of supporting and training Ukrainian forces. The pro-Russian government in Ukraine of Poroshenko collapsed. There was a coup where Biden was at that time vice president under Obama. Victoria Nuland organized this, supported it, and the pro-Russian government fell. Okay. And the new government, the right-wing government, came into power, which also started talking about the need for nuclear weapons in Ukraine and pushing this agenda. So this was not acceptable. And so this is a Russian narrative that they were forced, after they had really tried for 30 years, they had no option. And their strategy also, if you look, and we can go into it in the next question, they have gone on putting pressure. They could have really smashed Ukraine in a week, but they did not have that kind of tactics. They called it a special military operation. They first brought troops on the border, hoping to put pressure on talks. That didn't work. Then they tried to go into Kiev. That policy or strategy failed. And then they withdrew, and gradually you can see that their 40,000 troops of the Russians have been able to inflict a huge amount of cost and losses on Ukraine. It's really a war of attrition. The West has poured in almost, they promised $100 billion, huge amounts of weapons. And now Russia's narrative is they believe that this is a war of Russia against NATO, that it's not just against Ukraine. They call it proxy, but it's not really proxy. The Ukrainians are losing huge amounts of their soldiers. It's like a meat grinder, sorry to use this term, but it's really very, very sad. But there doesn't seem to be a way out because the Russians won't accept a defeat. And the West believes, and Stoltenberg, the NATO chief, has said that if Russia wins, it's a defeat for NATO. So these two very militarized nuclear power sides are at war, where the last Ukrainian is being destroyed.
Right. This actually brings me to my next question, which does the conflict signal a continuation of the Cold War or the beginning of a new one?
Well, in a sense, for the West, the Cold War did not end. You can see that the Cold War ended for Russia. They disbanded the Warsaw Pact. They disbanded all the collective military agreements that they had. They extended their hand of friendship. Repeatedly, they said they would like to be part of the Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe, that is the OSCE. But they were not given these terms. They were humiliated repeatedly. They also went in for the same system. So now it's not an ideological war that there was during the first Cold War of communists versus the capitalists. Now they're all equally capitalists. Russia has a thriving private sector. Of course, they have these oligarchs. A lot of Russian capital actually, through the oligarchs, went into the West. They all invested in the West. So a lot of that capital went in. So this new Cold War is a kind of a new Cold War, but it's not ideological. It's much more dangerous because now the enemies of this new Cold War, if you see, even yesterday, the US put out 3 national security strategies, the US military, in which they identify Russia and China. So China is their primary threat and Russia is the secondary threat. They feel they can defeat Russia. This war is going to be like Afghanistan. It will slowly bleed Russia. Russia will be decimated. And that is the effort of the West, of decimating Russia so that they just have China to deal with. And with China, there is now a strong economic war going on. You can see it in the Two Chips Act, the chips and the artificial intelligence, where even those Americans and others who are working in China, in these industries have been told that they either return or they will lose their citizenship.
Right.
And you can see what happened in Taiwan when Nancy Pelosi went. So every day there's some instance where there is a gradual provocation of China. Now, while we are seeing this provocation of China, if you look back the last 30 years, those of us who studied it could see the same kind of provocation with Russia. It took 30 years to flower into this war. So with China also, it could take 8 years, 10 years, no one knows. But they're provoking China in this gradual way. And one day China is just going to, and now, they, yesterday or day before, the Congress, US Congress passed an act where they are going to rearm Taiwan in a huge way. Now, this is not acceptable to China, giving them the kind of missiles, and they're building alliances, the US especially, but also NATO is expanding into the Indo-Pacific, which was not the case earlier. UK and US have this AUKUS agreement with Australia, where for the first time Australia will have nuclear-powered submarines, which they did not have even in the Cold War. Japan is on the verge of changing its constitution, where they're going to give up that article which called for it was a pacifist constitution, and they have 1,000 missiles aimed at China. So these are all little steps, and the Chinese are very clever people. They have not aligned, but they have supported Russia. They're concerned, and they have seen these developments, and they very acutely. So this is what the new Cold War is about. And there's one more issue that I want to take up, and that is the narrative of the global South. Now, we spoke of the two narratives, that of the collective West, that of Russia, and that of China. The Chinese narrative is, at least officially, they talk about the need for a common development, common peace. They say that we are committed to a peaceful rise. As you can see, we were a power which had, like the rest of the global South, we were humiliated, colonized, kept as semi-feudal, the opium wars, etc. And we have risen peacefully without annexing any other country, whereas the US has 800 bases just around Russia and military bases around Russia and China. So, but we're still extending a hand of friendship. We want common rise. Let us rise peacefully. But as Jeffrey Sachs, the great American economist, has said, that the Americans cannot bear this rise of a third world country which is starting to compete with them and even perhaps overtake them economically, though not militarily yet. The US is undoubtedly the most strongest military power. Now, as far as the third narrative that I'm talking about, the third narrative comes from the global South. It is not a hegemonic narrative. As you can see, the third world narratives have never been hegemonic. They do not have a voice in the international system, whether they're not in the Security Council or in the WTO or IMF or World Bank. They don't have the same amount of voting rights or any kind of really say. All they can do is come together and have some kind of resistance. But even then, the global South doesn't have any one single institution which can represent them. Of course, there was a non-aligned movement, but it was not institutionalized. It didn't have a secretariat. It did meet once in a couple of years, and it didn't have that kind of strength. Then there's that G77, which functions in the United Nations. Sometimes they coordinate at the most. So but in this war, Russia-Ukraine war, the global South, somehow the majority of the countries have said that they would like to be neutral, and they are neutral. And what does that neutrality mean? It's not a very progressive one. They have, of course, said we condemn war, but we would like diplomatic solutions, and we would like both sides to have peace. And we're willing to give our good offices for that peace. Both Turkey and India spoke to Zelensky, but even the peace deal, which was possible in April, which was coming, Boris Johnson went and it was stymied. So the voice of the Global South is really just that of neutrality. They believe that even though they have condemned the Russian aggression, they feel that Russia's strategic interests should be considered. They do not want a decimation of Russia. They do not see Russia as a threat. After all, it was Russia which supported many of the countries of the Global South during the national liberation movements, during their wars against the colonial powers like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, North Korea, etc. So the Global South does not see Russia as a threat. All of Latin America, all of Asia, all of Africa, all of Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, they want to stay away from this new Cold War. They are petrified because the Cold War, the first Cold War, was a hot war for the Global South. The wars, as I said, in Southeast Asia, the wars of liberation in Angola, Mozambique, and so on and so forth, and the huge amounts of intervention. Just in the last 10 years, there have been about 20 interventions. Iraq, Libya, Yemen, the in Africa, where millions have been killed. In Iraq, the 1 million people were killed. And Iraq was demolished on what? On a threat of weapons of mass destruction, which was not there. No one's apologized. No one has given reparations. So the Global South has scars and memories and legacy. And the fact is that they have gained from, they try to gain both from the West and from Russia and from China, depending on the region. So for India, for example, is gaining from Russian oil right now. They have been able to curb that inflation or the energy crisis, which Europe has been facing, because Europe sanctioned Russia, but India did not. So India is getting cheaper oil from Russia. Similarly, China. China gets 30% of Russian oil is imported by China. So, Russia is doing quite fine because China doesn't believe in unilateral sanctions. Venezuela, another country which produces oil, has been sanctioned because they don't have really a government which supports everything the Americans want them to support. India was sanctioned at one point when they went in for nuclear power and the nuclear experiments. So the Global South has a very different narrative. And they don't want to be part of this new Cold War.
And when you look at it, war is an expensive business in every sense of the word. And I don't just mean economically. And it's one we cannot afford in the current context as well. I mean, we are just coming out of, if it's safe to say, we are coming out of a pandemic. And there are threats of multiple new ones. The climate crisis persists, the refugee problems. There are several global challenges that we are still dealing with while this war is going on. Which also brings me to the next question, where you've mentioned in your article, and you've said that the Ukraine war is an illegal war. Does international law actually define what legal or illegal war is? And on a more philosophical note, can there ever be just war? Be a just war?
Well, you see, under Article 7 of the United Nations Charter, this war is an illegal war. There's no doubt about it. No country can violate the sovereignty of another country.
Sure.
So that's why I also consider it an illegal war, though I also believe that there were provocations by NATO, by the US, and for years, and that is why this war took place. But I'm not condoning war. I'm anti-war. So I would rather that there would be negotiations, that Russia withdraw, and that also but also remember that there was this Minsk I and Minsk II agreements between Ukraine, the area of the Donbass, that is Donetsk and Luhansk, Russia, and France and UK. But Zelensky violated the Minsk agreements, which would have made these areas regionally autonomous. There was a line of contact which would be demilitarized between this area, Ukraine and Russia. This was I thought, an excellent solution. But this was violated and the civil war went on.
Right.
So a just war, which you asked, a just war is when a country has a war when it faces an existential threat. For example, we would consider the Vietnam War for its liberation a just war. The war in Angola or the Francophone countries or Algeria against the French colonialism were just wars because their national movements were crushed. They didn't get a chance, like India had a huge national movement and was able to negotiate its independence and freedom non-violently. But those countries could not because of different circumstances. So that kind of war could be considered a just war. But these definitions are always loose, and very often they cannot be applied unilaterally to all cases. So it has to be a case by case. So, but nonetheless, this is a Russian aggression. But at the same time, I do believe that if the US wanted, they could have peace in a day, because the Ukrainian economy cannot survive for a day. The US and Europe are paying for their civil servants. They are paying for their daily salaries.
Yeah.
General Douglas McGregor, who is a wonderful analyst in the US, and he was advisor in the last government to national security, he gives, I listen to his podcast almost every day because he gives a very different analysis of the war.
Okay.
He believes that the Ukraine has lost at least 60 to 70,000 dead, which is the same number as the British Army. Now, which country can sustain this? But it's being hidden. It's not being said because of the American interest of decimating Russia. So the Ukrainians are actually being made a terrible victim of this collective West geopolitics in Europe.
Right.
So, no side can claim to have a just war. The Russians now have demolished the electricity grid. 60% of Ukraine is in darkness. Kiev has no running water. The metro is stalled. The grain deal, because there was a bombing of Sevastopol, the main Russian port, which is a humanitarian corridor. So again, you can see in the grain politics, Ukraine and Turkey and Russia did a deal to allow, because Ukraine is a grain basket, as is Russia.
Right.
60 to 70% of the world's grain, wheat, comes from these two areas, especially Russia, but even Ukraine.
Yes.
So the global south is suffering. A lot of the ASEAN countries, Africa, are dependent on this grain. So they did the grain deal. But it goes through these ports in the Black Sea. But day before yesterday, Sevastopol was bombed. And so Russia said, we have to suspend it because our guarantees were that there would be no bombing of our ships. And in any case, 50% of the grain which goes through these ports goes to Europe, and only 20% goes to the poorest countries. So Russia has said, we will give free grain to those countries which need it, but we are walking out of this grain deal, which is really tragic, because that was a way in which a follow-up negotiation, a diplomatic negotiation could have taken place.
Right. And this disruption in supply chains will not just have short-term effects, but also pretty critical long-term ones on several economies who are not even directly participating in this war. Um, so in your article for the EPW, you have suggested that there is no alternative to collaborative, inclusive security. But it raises two questions. One, could you elaborate a bit more on the drawbacks of the present approach to security? And two, who will guard collaborative security if its guarantor, which is the UNSC itself in many ways, remains hopelessly divided?
That's right. You see, currently, security is based on threat perception, and very often this threat perception is not even empirically backed. Because was Russia a threat to Europe at the current time? No, it wasn't. For 30 years, they have taken, they've had constructed these pipelines. Europe has prospered on account of cheap Russian energy. Russia is a huge mine of not only energy, but a lot of other commodities. Cobalt and lithium and a lot of minerals. Sure. Besides grain and fertilizers, and they kind of just took it for granted. But their threat was that Putin is crazy and he will, he will expand his empire and he will first go into Ukraine, then he will go to Poland and Romania. Now, the Poland and Romania do have a threat perception because of history, but there are ways to do it through collective and common security. Sure. That instead of, exclusive security, because what's happening in the second Cold War now, the West wants Russia to be thrown out of all multilateral institutions. Mm-hmm. They do not want it to be part of G20. They do not want to talk to it in the WTO, in the IMF. Right. So how can you can do that to Iraq or even to Iran, but you cannot do it. Has everyone seen the geography of Russia? It is Eurasia. They cannot deny geography. Absolutely. Can they marginalize India or China through exclusive security? This concept of security is based on a tragic realism because it will not guarantee security either to the West or the East or the North or the South. If you exclude powerful countries, they will get back in distorted ways. And this has happened repeatedly in history. But you can't repeat history and expect, you're going to get the same kind of results. You're not going to get different results unless you radically change your policy. If you have the same policy that you did in 1918, World War I, 1936, 39, when you had World War II, or you had the Cold War, but your same policy of threat, of isolation, or of separation, of exclusion, you're going to have these repeat wars. So really, I've argued for common security, which a lot of people do, as a new methodology, which would lead to more common peace. This common security, the backers are people like, it flows from the ideas of the Greek philosophers to Nelson Mandela, to Mahatma Gandhi, and the like. So it's not a new concept, but we need to cull it out and develop it in that way. And the Olof Palme Institute had brought out a brilliant report called The Common Security. And now the Olof Palme Institute in April 2022 brought out a second version of this common security. So that is what I'm arguing for.
Right. We have one audience question that I can take up. How would you see the Russia-Ukraine conflict from the perspective of neorealism?
Well, look, the core cause, the root cause of this conflict is the commitment that all these countries, both Russia, China, the West, all these countries have to a realist and neorealist approach. The realist approach and the neorealist approach is really, they see the international system as anarchic. and that there's no force which can control the international system, that the only way to get ahead is through force. And the reason why you don't have constant wars is because of balance of power. And neorealism differs from realism because it brings in the idea, one, of institutions like the United Nations and other institutions, and multilateralism and non-state actors, which was absent in realism. And finally, neorealism is quite flexible. It's brought in feminist approaches and critical approaches to some extent, but its core remains the same, that you have to keep extending your power, increasing your power in order to... so basically, neorealism is all about what American foreign policy is. It's a theoretical basis of the US foreign policy, and there's a strategic mirroring. If American foreign policy is like that, the Chinese and the Russian foreign policy will be similar. They'll also... So this is what they call as a security dilemma, that you have 2 bombs, we'll have at least 1. So there's a mutually assured destruction, MAD.
Right.
And there's no hope for common security within neorealism. So really, these things have to be challenged, and there are cracks, and there is a rethinking. And I think in a few weeks, we are going to see this terrific winter, and the real misery of the Ukrainian people. And if even then the collective West does not negotiate, they are going to see the complete destruction. Because what the Russians will do is they'll take over Odessa next. They've taken over 4 regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Kharkiv. And next, the only thing left is crossing the Dnieper and moving into Odessa, which they would love. It was always part of Russia since so many centuries, but Soviet Union collapsed, so it happened to be, at that time part of Ukraine. Right. So either, they recognize this, and I think even Henry Kissinger, Mershima, who are all realist thinkers, they have said that this war was wrong. The US should have always used Ukraine as a bridge between Russia and the West. And even now, you need to negotiate, have a territorial decision, maybe give up some, get some. Because for Kissinger and Mersheimer, China is the main threat, not Russia. And that was a policy which Trump was trying to follow in his fuddled, crazy way. But Biden is a neocon, that is a neoconservative. And he really is looking for complete US hegemony on the international system, but he's unlikely to get it. The world is definitely moving. The Russians, Indians, Chinese call it a multipolar world. But since I'm not part of any state, I would argue that it should be a multi-centric world. There should be centers of powers which can collaborate and work together.
Absolutely, ma'am. You've also argued that Russia is trying to revive its imperial ambitions over former republics. Can it be called the collective determination of Russia as a country, or an individual ambition of Putin himself? And how has it been affecting the internal politics of the country?
Well, look, it's clear that this is an argument which was given by the West, that Putin would like to have the old Soviet Union, but it's impossible. It's not. What Putin has said in many of his speeches, and there's no reason not to believe him or to engage with him, as Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor, said, that one should speak to him, at least understand him. What he is concerned about are the Russians who lived, Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic state and Russians lived everywhere. And then all these countries became independent. And suddenly the Russians found themselves in a new country, no longer in Russia. They were in Ukraine or Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia or Georgia. And all these places had this new nationalism where they were doing their identity politics of being Georgian or Ukrainian. And then they started marginalizing the Russian citizens and seeing them as an unneeded minority. So Putin has said that all these Russians, I will safeguard them, which is not possible, actually. I mean, you have to give up. And this is what he did in Ukraine, tried to safeguard the Russians. And this led to the war. But all these countries should also give them citizenship rights. That is what is important. And it's not just Putin, it is the Russian deep state. And there is support for Putin's policies amongst the Russian people. If earlier he had let's say 70% polls which are recognized even by the West supporting him, today he has 80 to 90% because they've seen this war, they've seen this humiliation. And mind you, the Russians are capable of a lot. I have studied the Second World War. I studied the Cuban Missile Crisis. They have strength to revive again and again and rebuild. And I think the Indians recognize this. And that is why they have a sympathy for the Russians overall. That is because in India, there's a consensus on this foreign policy. And no matter how much the Russians are going to lose, and they are definitely going to lose a lot. After all, it's, now one country against the entire NATO, which is like 27 countries putting in arms and money into Ukraine, even though they're not fighting there physically. So Russia will lose a lot. But you can see that they call this a special military operation, and they still do. And they used actually kid gloves compared to the capacity and capability that they possess. Right now, the gloves are off. They're waiting for negotiations. If it doesn't happen, they will crush it more and more. You'll see the Russian military machine. The mobilization which took place, they got, officially 250,000 men have come back. So they can go back, rest, and they be refurbished. And this is a huge wave. This is going to keep coming. So they're not defeatable in Europe. They are the ones who defeated the Nazis. They took 27 million dead in the Second World War, but they followed the Nazis into Berlin. They liberated Poland, Hungary, Romania, even Austria, the Czech republics, Yugoslavia. So they're seeing it as that kind of existential threat. And the last thing I want to say is the fear of nuclear weapons. Now, the Russian nuclear strategy is very clear. They will not bomb a non-nuclear country, and they will only use nuclear weapons if some other power uses them against them first. And second, if the existence of Russia is at threat, if Russia is going to be totally destroyed, like Moscow is going to fall. Yeah. So then they're willing to use nuclear weapons. And it's a hugely nuclear weaponized country. They have, from what I've read, 6,000 nuclear weapons to America's 8,000 nuclear weapons. Right. And it can demolish the world. And now climate is on the back burner as a consequence of this war. Right. So it's really an eyeball to eyeball kind of confrontation. And there's very little that the global south can do. They keep appealing. There's going to be a G20 meeting in Bali in November 15 in Indonesia. So again, the countries, that is a place where the countries of the south, the important countries, India, Indonesia, etc., meet the countries of the north. Again, they could put pressure, but it completely depends on how the West moves and whether they are willing to have a negotiated settlement, because Russia is going to not settle for anything less.
Right. You've also argued that the US has a renewed vision of a unipolar world, and you've mentioned this right now as well. However, given the existence of many poles of power in international politics today, or as you envision a multi-centric world, can a unipolar world actually be still imagined on a practical level? How can we think of a more inclusive and equitable global order?
Well, look, the US, this is part of their narrative, it's part of their policy, it's part of their strategic doctrines that they would like a unipolar world and they're working towards it. And that is why that they're targeting China, because they see China as a main threat to unipolarity. But as a concept, it's over. This is not the colonial period. It's not the period of the Cold War where the global south had become subjects. It's not just China. There are many emerging countries. Latin America today is not listening to a thing that the US is saying.
Sure.
Nelly Prador, who is the foreign minister of South Africa, Blinken went to South Africa 2 months ago and in a press conference, and they had just passed 2 bills, the US Congress. One bill was the Malign Activities of Russia Act, which said that any African country which engages with Russia will face sanctions from the US. And the second was the CHIPS Act of China, that China will not get any technology related to chips and artificial intelligence from the US. And they were verging on the fact that Africa should not have anything to do with China. So the foreign minister of South Africa, she turned around with Blinken present and said that I am, and you can see the quote, she says that these are negative legislations. We oppose them, and I ask all of Africa to engage with whichever country they want. Right. So on your face, multicentrism or multipolarity. Next month, the Indian Prime Minister will go to Russia and have a face-to-face meeting as usual as part of India-Russia strategic partnership. But they will also have the INSTEC corridor, which goes from Moscow to, through Iran to India and through Syria for gas and trade. But they also want to have agreements with the US. So they're also part of Quad. So both sides, look at Turkey. It's part of NATO, but it's negotiating with Russia. And Putin has promised a new pipeline, the Turk Stream 2. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 were kind of sabotaged. Right. So now they're saying that we'll make Turkey into a hub for export of Russian gas. Of course, the NATO is very upset with Turkey, but they can do nothing about it. Turkey's become that powerful. Similarly, Indonesia, Malaysia, they've all said we will engage with both Russia and China. We're not going to close our BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. We've gained from it. So what kind of unipolarity can they have with they'll make Europe and the US into an island. And you can see their trade minister of the US, Yellen, she said that we would like friend shoring, meaning trade between allies. Now, can you manage trade just between allies and ignore the rest of the... So, this friend shoring actually reminded me of the earlier kind of narrative they had of trade follows flag. That was at the time of colonialism. So this is like trade follows friend. So it's not going to really work, and it hasn't worked. So there's no chance of a unipolar world. It's a nice dream to have, maybe nice for the US elections, but it's not going to work. And I think there can be a paradigm shift.
Absolutely, fair enough. In your article, you also hint towards the double standards when it comes to implementing human rights. For instance, the refugee crisis, violence, etc., is observable in countries such as Yemen or Palestine. What steps can be taken to actually make the UN more democratized? And what role can people's movements play in such scenarios?
Well, look, civil society is very important, the international civil society, but it's being crushed. Because if you speak like what I've said now, or what Jeffrey Sachs says, or even what Kissinger, even Mershama, they've been called by the US State Departments as being, giving the Russian point of view. So they don't, it's either with us or against us. There's no third way. And this kind of narrative sharpens during wars. You say either you're with us or against us. So that's not possible, really. There has to be a third way. There has to be different views. And if countries who stand for human rights, who stand for migrant rights, and it's wonderful how they treated the Ukrainian migrants, welcomed them with open arms. But, the Africans saw this happening. The Indian students who were thrown out saw this happening, that they were not given the same kind of preferential treatment as the Ukrainians were because of color. So race is an issue in foreign policy. Sometimes it decreases. And of course, it's much better than it was earlier, but it's still not the ideal form yet. So really, there is a long way to go. There is a need for the democratization of the Security Council and more powers to the UN General Assembly, where each voice has a vote. The Security Council are those 5 permanent members, P5. They can veto anything. Others don't have a voice and they don't have voting rights, even if they're invited as members in the circulating Security Council. A lot of the countries in the global south have argued that there should be reforms, but unless the Security Council P5 don't accept it, which they don't, there can be no movement forward.
Right. And ultimately, they don't want that diffusion of power to happen because they get further shots.
And that's the beneficial.
Right, absolutely. So my last question to you is that a best case scenario that you've proposed is that the EU and Russia become partners of the Ukraine. What is your solution for the strategies the contending countries will have to adopt to realize this goal?
Well, look, the way forward, a possible negotiated way forward, and many people have proposed this, including Elon Musk, for example, and Kissinger, and Mershema, and a large number of people who are watching this situation very closely, is that if Ukraine commits to its neutrality, of course it should become part of the European Union. They will, rebuild it. Both Russia and the European Union and the US should rebuild Ukraine. This area of the Donbass become neutral territory. All of Ukraine be neutral. They don't even apply for membership of NATO for the next, let's say, 20, 30 years. And it be a bridge between Europe and Russia. Let everyone develop, but these are all ideals. I don't know what will happen when there is any settlement. Obviously, it seems that Russia can declare victory, or the war can broaden to Poland and Hungary, which will be terrible. So let's see what happens.
Right. But I think from this conversation, one thing emerges very strongly, which is the pressing need to build a much more inclusive global order, and to reimagine all the institutions within it. So thank you so much, Professor, for all your invaluable insights. And thank you to those who were patiently watching. If anyone wants to read Professor Chinoy's article, it is very much available on our website. Also, small request here, please subscribe to the EPW. Thank you so much again, Professor, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye, ma'am.
Bye.